Hello there again, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the last Elsa chapter, which was chapter 4. Hope you've all had a nice weekend so far, and for those in America, that your Labour weekend has been peaceful and safe. Okay, enjoy the rest of it. Okay, chapter 5, Safari to Lake Rudolph. Elsa was now 18 months old, and I noticed for the first time that she had temporarily, as it proved, developed a strong smell. She had two glands, known as the anal glands, under the root of her tail. Though these exuded a strong-smelling secretion, which she ejected with her urine against certain trees, and although it was her own smell, she always pulled up her nose in disgust at it. One afternoon, after we had returned to Isolo, we met a herd of eland. Elsa instantly began to stalk them. These large antelope were grazing on a steep slope and had several young amongst them. One eland cow waited for her, and before she got too close to the calves, distracted her attention from the youngsters by playing hide-and-seek with her in the bushes. In this way she kept her engaged until the herd and the calves had safely disappeared beyond the hillside. Then the eland cow galloped off at high speed, leaving poor Elsa standing. Another case of animal diplomacy was fascinating to watch. We had taken Elsa up a hill behind the house, from the top of which we saw a herd of about 80 elephant, with many small calves feeding below. Elsa saw them too, and before we could shout, "No!" she went off downhill, and a few moments later was advancing cautiously towards the herd. Nearest to her was a cow with a small calf. Elsa stalked it with great cunning, but the mother elephant was well aware of her intention. We watched, tense with anxiety, expecting a charge, but to our surprise the mother elephant moved quietly between Elsa and the calf, pushing it slowly towards some big bulls, keeping our lioness on the far side. Disappointed, Elsa looked for the next best playmate and used careful cover to join two feeding bulls. Oh boy, that ain't good. But again she was ignored. Then she tried to provoke other small groups of elephant, advancing to within a few yards of them. Still nothing happened. The sun was getting low. We shouted to her, but she obstinately disregarded our calls. Finally, we had no alternative but to return home without her. She certainly intended to take her time, and we could only rely on her intelligence to keep her out of trouble. I waited for her inside the enclosure, reading, but my thoughts were not on the book. Horrible visions played tricks with my imagination, and I became more and more worried. What could we do? Chaining Elsa up during the elephant season would only frustrate and infuriate her. Indeed, it might end up by making her dangerous. We had to let her learn her limitations by experience, allow her to weigh the fun against the boredom or danger of playing with these big animals. In doing so, perhaps she would come to lose interest in them. By this time she was 3 hours overdue, and I feared an accident, when suddenly I heard her familiar hunk, hunk, and in she came, very thirsty indeed. Yet before she went to her water bowl, she licked my face and sucked my thumbs, as if to tell me how glad she was to be with me again. She smelled strongly of elephant, and I could well imagine how close she had been to them, and that she had rolled in their droppings. By the way she flung herself with a crash to the ground, I could also judge how tired she was. I felt very humble. Here was my friend, just returned from a world that was utterly denied to me, yet she was as affectionate as ever. Did she have any realization of the extraordinary link she was between the two worlds? Of all animals, giraffe were her undoubtedly favourite. Often she stalked them until both sides became tired. Then she would sit down waiting for the giraffe to return And sure enough, after a time they would approach again, advancing slowly, step by step, facing Elsa, looking at her with their large, sad eyes, while their slender necks arched in an inquisitive way. Then, usually browsing at their favourite acacia seeds as they went by, they would walk peacefully away. But sometimes Elsa would drive them in proper lion fashion. After spotting them, she would turn off at right angles, downwind, crouching with her belly close to the ground, every muscle quivering, until she had encircled the herd. Then she would drive it towards us. No doubt we were expected to wait in ambush and kill the victims she had so cleverly rounded up for us. Other animals also attracted her attention. For instance, one day she sniffed the air, then dashed into a thick bush. Soon afterwards we heard crashing and snorting coming straight at us. Quickly we jumped out the way as a warthog thundered past, with Elsa hot in his heels. Both disappeared at lightning speed, and for a long time we heard them breaking through the wood. We were very worried for Elsa's safety, as the warthog has formidable tusks, which he can use to kill. Till she returned, the winner of the chase rubbed her head against our knees and told us about her new playmate. Our next safari was to take us to Lake Rudolph, a stretch of brackish water some 180 miles long, reaching to the Ethiopian frontier. We were to be away for 7 weeks, and most of the time we should travel on foot with pack donkeys and mules. It would be Elsa's first experience of a foot safari in the company of donkeys, and we could only hope that both sides would accept each other. We were quite a party, George and myself, Julian, a game warden from a neighbouring territory, Herbert, who was again our guest, as well as game scouts, drivers and personal servants, 6 sheep to feed Elsa on the way, and 35 donkeys and mules. The pack animals were sent off 3 weeks ahead to meet us on tile shores of the lake, while we travelled the distance of about 300 miles by motor transport. It was a convoy, 2 Land Rovers, my 1.5-ton truck with Elsa in the back of it, and 2 3-ton lorries. The latter were necessary to enable us to carry, as well as the men, sufficient food and petrol for the weeks we should be away. Also 80 gallons of water. Our first 180 miles led us through the sandy, hot, and dusty plains of the Kaisut Desert. Then we ascended the volcanic slopes of the Marsabit Mountain, an isolated volcano mass rising in 4,500 feet out of the surrounding desert, clothed in thick, cool, lichen-covered forest, and often enveloped in mist. It presented a welcome contrast to the hot and country below, to the heat and country below. It is a game paradise and harbours elephant, carrying some of the finest ivory in Africa, besides rhino, buffalo, the greater kudu, lion, and lesser game. Here was the last administrative post. From now on, we made our way through practically uninhabited country and were cut off from any contact with the outside world. Nothing broke the monotony of the sand gullies and lava ridges. The only incident was a crash, which nearly broke my car in half. One back wheel left us, and we came to an abrupt stop. Poor Elsa, it took hours to repair the damage, and she had to spend the time inside the car, since it proved the only shade from the fierce sun which she hated. However, she was most cooperative, and although she did not, like strange Africans, obligingly put up with the jabbering crowd of our people, who pressed close to the car, trying to be helpful. When we were mobile again, we climbed up the most shocking track into the Hari Hills on the Ethiopian border. These are desolate, and though higher than Marsabit, attract less moisture. An enervating gale blows across their slopes, and in consequence they are barren of forest. Elsa was quite bewildered by the fierce wind, and had to spend the night in the truck, well protected with canvas curtains from its icy blast. George's purpose in visiting these hills was to examine the game situation and to see whether there were any signs of poaching by the Gaba tribesmen. After a few days spent in patrolling the country, we turned westward, crossing the most depressing, desolate lava country, where sharp rocks jerked the car mercilessly, and Elsa had a tough time as we pushed the vehicles through deep sandy riverbeds or ground our way carefully between boulders, jostling against the large stones. At last we came out onto the Chalabi Desert, a dry ancient lake bed some 80 miles in length, with a smooth, fairly firm surface on which a vehicle can travel at full speed. Mirages are the most remarkable feature of this area. Great expanses of water with palm trees reflected in their surface appear, but swiftly vanish as one approaches them. Here, too, gazelles assume the proportions of elephants and appear to be walking on the waters. It is a land of thirst and grilling heat. At the western end of Chalabi lies the oasis of North Hor, where there is a police post and where thousands of camels, sheep and goats belonging to the Rindili tribe come to water. Another remarkable sight to be seen there in the morning is that of thousands of sandgrouse flying in to drink at the few pools. Now soon as there was nothing to keep us at North Hall, we filled our water containers and continued on our way. At last, after 230 miles of hustling and bumping, we reached Lower Galan, an oasis of fresh water springs in a grove of palms near the south of Lake Rudolph. Here we found our donkeys waiting for us. We took Elsa at once to the lake, which was 2 miles distant. She rushed into the water as though to throw off the strain of the journey, and plunged in right amongst the crocodiles, which are very plentiful in Lake Rudolph. Luckily they were not aggressive, but all the same we tried to scare them away. During our safari, their floating horny shapes, silhouetted all along the shore, were to make bathing, at least for us, a dubious pleasure. At Lolagalan, we established our base camp and spent the next 3 days in repairing saddlery and the packing donkey loads. Each load weighed approximately 50 pounds, 2 to each donkey. At last all was ready. There were 18 donkeys loaded with food and camping gear, 4 with water containers, 1 riding mule for anyone who went weak or lame, and 5 spare donkeys. I was worried about what Elsa's attitude towards the donkeys was going to be. She watched all our repacking with restrained interest. Then when we started loading, she had to be chained up, for the sight of so much lovely meat braying and kicking and rolling in the sand in an endeavour to throw off unwanted burdens, with shouting Africans rushing about trying to bring order into the chaos, made her tense with excitement. The main cavalcade started off in the morning, and we followed with Elsa later in the day when it was cooler. Our march was northwards along the shoreline. Elsa was very excited and rushed like a puppy from one to the other of us. Then she dashed in among the flocks of flamingos, retrieved a duck we had shot, and finally went swimming in the lake, where one of us had to cover her with a rifle on account of the crocodiles. Later, when we passed a herd of camels, I was obliged to put her on the chain. This made her furious, and her efforts to meet these new friends nearly pulled my arms off. I, however, had no wish to see a stampeding, panic-stricken herd of camels falling over each other, bellowing, gurgling, legs intertwined, and Elsa in their midst. Fortunately, these were the last livestock we met along the shore. When night fell, we saw the fires of the camp by the lake. Again, I put Elsa on the chain for fear that she might have enough energy left to chase our donkeys. When we arrived, we found camp already pitched and everything laid out for dinner. While we had a belated sundowner, we decided that at dawn each morning, the lion party, George and I, Nuru, a game scout as guide, and Elsa would start off while camp was being struck and the animals saddled and loaded. In this way, we would benefit by the cooler hours, and the pack animals would follow at a safe distance, dispensing us from any need to keep Elsa on the chain. Then about 9:30 we would look for a shady place where we could rest during the heat of the day, and the donkeys could get some grazing. As soon as these were sighted, we would put Elsa on the chain. In the afternoon we would reverse our routine, the donkey party leaving 2 hours before the lion party and pitching camp before dark. We kept on this routine during the whole safari, and it worked out very well, for it kept Elsa and the donkeys apart, except during the midday rest, when she was chained up and very sleepy. As it turned out, both parties soon learned to take each other for granted and to accept that everything which formed part of the safari must be tolerated. We found that Elsa marched well until about 9 in the morning. Then she began to feel the heat and kept stopping wherever a rock or bush gave shade. In the afternoon she was reluctant to move before 5. After that, once her pads had hardened, she could have gone on all night. On an average, she trotted from 7 to 8 hours daily and kept in wonderful condition. She dipped herself in the lake and swam as often as possible, often only 6 or 8 feet from the crocodiles. No shouting or waving on my part would bring her back until she felt like doing so. Usually we reached camp between 8 and 9 in the evening. Often the donkey party would fire very lights to guide us. The second day out, we left the last human habitation behind us. It was a small fishing village of the primitive El Molo tribe. This tribe numbers about 80 souls who live almost entirely on fish, varied occasionally by crocodile and hippo meat. As a result of this badly balanced diet and of interbreeding, many of them are deformed and show signs of rickets, perhaps also owing to malnutrition, or more likely to the fact that the lake water contains a high proportion of natron and other minerals. They also suffer from bad teeth and gums. They are friendly and generous people, and a stranger is always welcomed with a gift of fresh fish. Their fishing is mostly carried on by means of nets, which they make out of palm fiber, the only fiber that does not rot in the alkaline water, while the giant Nile perch, which runs up to 200 pounds and over, and crocodile and hippo are harpooned from rafts made from 3 palm logs lashed roughly together. These unwieldy craft are poled along in the shallows and never venture out for fear of the violent winds, which often sweep the lake and sometimes attain a velocity of over 90 miles an hour. Indeed, it is the wind which makes life thoroughly uncomfortable for any traveller in this region. It is impossible to pitch a tent. Food is either blown out of the plate before one can eat it, or so covered with grit as to be inedible. Sleep is almost impossible because of the tearing gusts which fill eyes, nose, and ears with sand and almost lift up the bed. Yet in spite of these torments, the lake has real beauty in its quieter moments, and exercises a fascination difficult to describe, which makes one want to return again and again. The first 10 days took us along its shore. The country around was grim, lava and more lava. Only the consistency of the lava differed. Sometimes it was cinder-fine dust, at others sharp-edged, so that our feet became sore from slipping and sliding along over the uneven ground. In certain places there was deep sand, and as we waded along, each step was an effort. Or again, we had to make our own way across coarse grit or pebbles, and at all times the hot wind blew, sapping our energy and making us feel dizzy. There was little vegetation, only a few thorny plants which pricked, and razor-edged grass, which cut the skin. To keep Elsa's paws in good condition, I had often to grease them, as an act which she seemed to understand and to like. During the midday rest, I usually lay on my camp bed so as to be able to relax in more comfort than the hard pebbles provided. Elsa saw the point of this, adopted my idea, and joined me. Soon I could consider myself fortunate if she left me a small corner, and sometimes I was unlucky and had to sit on the ground while she stretched herself full length on the bed. But as a rule we curled up together on the bed, I hoping that it might not break beneath our combined weight. During our long marches, Nuru always carried drinking water and a bowl for Elsa. She had her evening meal towards 9 o'clock, and afterwards slept heavily, tied up near my bed. One evening we lost our way and were guided by very lights to the camp, which we reached late at night. Elsa seemed exhausted, so I left her unchained to recover. But although she looked sleepy, she suddenly rushed at full speed to the thorn enclosure in which the donkey spent the night, and crashed through the fence in real feline style. Braying, panic, and pandemonium ensued, and before we could intervene, all the donkeys had bolted into the darkness. Luckily, we soon caught Elsa, and I gave her a good hiding. She seemed to understand that she deserved it, and as far as she could, showed that she was sorry. I felt guilty at having underestimated her natural instinct and the tremendous temptation that a nice-smelling donkey herd must be to her, especially at an hour when the hunting spirit is most alive in wild animals. Luckily, only one poor donkey had received scratches, and these were not serious. I dressed them and they soon healed, but this episode was a warning to me never to leave her unguarded. Fish were plentiful, and as a rule, George and Julian were able to keep the camp supplied with delicious fish called giant tilapia, a specialty unique to Lake Rudolph. These they caught either by rod and line or by stunning them with a rifle bullet. The game scouts seemed to prefer the ugly-looking catfish, which lay in the shallows and which they were able to kill with sticks and stones. Elsa was always ready to join in the fun, and sometimes she would retrieve a catfish, soon to drop it and wrinkle up her nose in disgust. One day we saw Nuru, who always carried a shotgun, lifting it up by the barrel and clubbing a catfish with it. He did this with such force that the stock split through in many places, broke, and projected at right angles to the barrel. Nuru was so delighted with his catfish that he was quite oblivious to the damage he had done. When George pointed it out to him, he replied calmly, "Oh, Mungo, God will help you to get another one." Mungo is God. To get another gun. Elsa, however, took her revenge, for she ran off with Nuru's sandals, which she had left on the shore, and galloped away with them. It was a funny sight to watch the two trying to outwit each other. In the end, the sandals were in poor shape when their owner got them back. Before we reached Alia Bay, some 100 miles to the north, it was necessary to cross the long Lungotty River. Wait, let me read that whole thing again. Before we reached Alia Bay, some 100 miles to the north, it was necessary to cross the Lungotty Range. In several places, the hills fall straight into the lake, so the donkeys with their bulky loads had to make a detour inland, while the lion party struggled across the rocks and kept to the shore. At one point, we looked like being defeated by a difficult corner, for here Elsa, to wade round the point, had the choice of either jumping down a 15-foot cliff covered with a slippery deposit on which it was impossible for her to get any grip, to land in the shallow water below, or by scrambling down an equally steep rock to land in the foaming waters which crashed against its foot. The water was in fact only about her own depth, but the foam made it look very dangerous, and she did not know what to do. She tried every ledge of the rock, paddling desperately on her small platform, till bravely she jumped into the lashing waves, and finally, coaxed by us, soon reached dry ground. It was touching to see how delighted and proud she was of her achievement, and also at having pleased us. For most of the way we had to drink and to cook with brackish lake water, which, although harmless and so soft that it is beautiful for bathing, and does not need soap for washing, has a disagreeable taste and tainted all our food. So it was indeed a pleasant surprise to find a little spring of fresh water at the foot of the hills called Moati. The route we took along the western foot of these hills had, so far as we knew, never been travelled by a European. The few who had visited this region in the past had kept well to the coast. 9 days out of Lolongen, we camped at the northern end of the hills. As usual, we had sent a party of game scouts ahead to spy out the country and keep a lookout for poachers. Early in the afternoon they returned and reported seeing a large body of men in canoes. The only tribe on the lake which possesses proper dugout canoes is the Galubaba, a turbulent people, well supplied with rifles, who constantly carry out raids from across the Ethiopian border into our territory, looting and murdering. The band which the scouts had seen might be either a raiding party or a poaching and fishing expedition. In any case, they had no right to be there. Elsa and I remained in camp with 4 game scouts armed with rifles to protect us, while the rest of the party went off to check. When they had reached the top of the ridge which overlooked the bay, they saw 3 canoes with 12 men on board, close inshore, paddling in the direction of our camp. However, they at once spotted our party, and so by the time George and the other men had reached the water's edge, the canoes were a good 200 yards out, making for a small island and paddling madly. They did not appear to have firearms, though, of course, they might have had rifles concealed in the canoes. Looking through the glasses, George saw a body of at least 40 men on the island, and several canoes drawn up on its shore. He watched the canoes reach the beach, and an obviously excited group gather round them. Then, since without a boat there was nothing much they could do, the party returned to camp. We packed up at once and moved to the bay below, as close as possible to the island. That night, extra sentries were posted, and every man slept with his rifle, loaded beside him. When dawn broke, we saw that the island was deserted. Evidently, the Galubaba had not liked the look of us and had decided to get away during the hours of darkness. In spite of a heavy gale which had blown up during the night, to make sure they had really gone, George sent patrols along the shore. Soon after sunup, we saw a multitude of vultures and marabous descending upon the island. This led us to suppose that the Galubaba had been on a poaching and fishing expedition, and had no doubt killed several hippo, on the remains of which the vultures and storks had come to rest. At about 11 in the morning, 2 canoes suddenly issued out a dense belt of reeds. To the south of the camp and made for open water. To discourage them, George put a few bullets across their bows, which sent them back into the reeds in a hurry. He then sent some scouts to try to make contact with the Galubaba and persuade them to come ashore. But although the scouts managed to get within hailing distance, the poachers would not respond and retreated further into the swamp. Throughout the day we could see their heads bobbing above the reeds to inspect us. We estimated that there were 4 canoes in the reeds, probably stragglers from the main body. Since it was impossible to reach them, George thought the next best thing was to encourage them to make for home. So as soon as it was dark, he fired tracer bullets and a few fairy lights at intervals over the swamp. By now our supplies were running low and it was time to turn back. As it turned out, the first part of the safari was a luxury compared to the second because we had plenty water from the lake. Now, instead of retracing our steps, we decided to take an inland route. Goiti, our Turkana guide, did not seem very sure of the way, and what was worse, was not certain whether we should find water when needed, for the region was dependent on water holes, which at this dry season were few and far between. George, however, calculated that we should never be more than a long day's march from the lake, so, if pressed for water, we could make for it. We missed the cooling breeze off the lake, and there were times when I felt nearly dehydrated by the heat. The country here was even more desolate than the one that we had passed through on our outward march. There was nothing but lava, so understandably there was little game and no population. Luckily we had bought sheep at the Loangalane, and although Elsa's living larder was rapidly dwindling away, it was sufficient to solve her feeding problem. But all of us lost most of our surplus weight during this time. Our march back was rapid because the donkeys were now carrying less weight, and much of the route being waterless, we had to do longer marches. When after 18 days we got back to Loyongalane, we found that the scouts we had left behind to protect our base had not been idle. They produced 4 Turkana poachers who had been caught trapping game. The oldest greeted George with great affection and reminded him that some 10 years ago he had caught him committing the same offence and had sent him to jail at Marsabit. He said that he had quite enjoyed his enforced stay there, but did not wish to repeat it. Owing to his age, George relented and unofficially sentenced him to be donkey driver for the rest of the safari. From Loyongalane, the men went to North Hall, where there were 3 Somali shops to buy food for the Africans. At the police station, George learned from the African inspector in charge that a gang of 8 mounted poachers armed with rifles had been seen between Loyongalane and North Hall. These poachers are usually Boran tribesmen from across the border, mounted on ponies which had been trained to go without water for 4 or 5 days, and often armed with rifles. They ride down and shoot giraffe. They are harboured by their compatriots on our side of the border, who give them prompt warning of approaching patrols. However, in this case, a camel patrol had followed the raiders' tracks for several days, finally surprised them, wounded 1 man and captured 7 ponies. We spent 3 days at Loyongalane, refitting, mending, saddlery, etc., in preparation for the second part of our safari, the ascent of Mount Kula. This mountain, which lies 20 miles east of the lake, rises out of the surrounding desert to about 7,500 feet. It catches all the moisture from the monsoon on its upper levels and has developed rich forest on its summit. It is a narrow volcano, 28 miles long, with a crater in the center about 4 miles wide. This crater is split in half and divides the mountain into a southern and northern portion. There is a theory that, after the volcano became extinct, an earthquake broke Kulual into deep crevices and cracked the awe-inspiring fissure through the crater. Its smooth walls are split like the peel of an orange when it is cut. These deep ridges fall 3,000 feet from the crater's lip. At the bottom, invisible from the top, is a gorge called Elsa, which leads into the heart of the mountain. Its sheer walls tower hundreds of feet high, and the opening is in places so narrow that the sky above is only visible through a slit. We tried to explore the gorge, entering it from the only accessible opening. which lies towards the east foot of Kululal. But we were defeated after a few hours by huge rocks and deep water pools which blocked the way. To cover the mountain thoroughly, it was necessary to go up one half, down again to the bottom, and then up the second part. The object of the safari was to find out whether the game on the mountain was holding its own or decreasing as a result of poaching, by comparing the present situation with that found by George when 12 years previously he had last visited the area. In particular, we wanted to investigate the state of the Greater Kudu. Kulal does not look impressive from below, a long stretching mountain with broad ridges leading to its summit. As we were to discover, these ridges became so narrow that the approaches for pack animals was very limited. The first day's march over thickly strewn lava boulders was extremely arduous for laden animals. Later, the ascent up knife-edged ridges was, in many places, very difficult to negotiate, and we found it necessary to offload the donkeys and manhandle the loads. On the second night, we were 2/3 of the way up the mountain and camped in a precipitous valley choked with lava boulders near a little spring, which provided just sufficient water for one animal at a time. It was very late before the last donkey had its much-needed drink. This was one of the few water holes on Kulal, and so it was naturally a vital centre for the Samburura tribesmen, who bring their livestock up to the Kulal in the dry season. It must have been difficult for Elsa to meet these large herds of camels, goats, cattle, and sheep around this and other water holes, but she was intelligent and good-natured, and apparently realizing what the situation was, she put up with the tantalizing smell of these animals, which often passed within a few feet of her. On these occasions we put her on the chain, but she made no attempt to attack, and only wanted to get away from the dust and the noise. The route up Kulal was steep, and the climate became arctic as we reached the higher slopes. We walked over saddles, crossed deep ravines, and struggled along precipices. Here the bush was lower, and then it changed into beautiful alpine flora. Next morning we reached the top of Kulal. It was a relief to be walking on more or less even ground. Camp was pitched in a beautiful little glade, close to a rather muddy spring, fouled by the cattle of the Samburu tribesmen. Their astonishment was great at finding a nearly full-grown lion in their camp. In the dense forest belts near the top, on most mornings, there was a heavy mist, so we made a blazing cedar log fire to keep us warm. At night it was so cold that I kept Elsa in my small tent, made her a nest of lichen, and covered her with my warmest blanket. Most of my night was usually spent replacing it, as it fell off continually, and Elsa would begin to shiver. When I did this, she always licked my arm. She never made any attempt to tear the tent and get out. On the contrary, she remained in it long after her usual waking hour, snuggling in her nest, where she was warm and cozy, whereas outside there was a blasting gale and wet mist. But as soon as the sun had cleared the fog away, she came to life and enjoyed the invigorating mountain air. Indeed, she loved the place, for the ground was soft and cool, the forest gave thick shade, and there were plenty of buffalo droppings to roll in. Because of the shade and the altitude, walking during the heat of the day was no effort in this region, and she was able to explore the mountain with us. She watched the eagles circling high in the air, and was annoyed by the crows who followed her and dived low to tease her, and on one occasion woke a buffalo out of his sleep and chased him. She had excellent scent, hearing, and eyesight, and never lost herself in the thick undergrowth. One afternoon we were following the advance party, which had gone well ahead through the forest, and Elsa was ambushing us in a playful way from behind every bush, when suddenly, from the direction in which she had just disappeared, we heard a panic-stricken bray. A moment later, a donkey broke through the wood, with Elsa clinging to it and mauling it. Fortunately, the forest was so thick that they could not go very fast, so we quickly reached the struggling pair and gave Elsa the beating we thought she deserved. She had never done anything of this sort before, and I was very alarmed, for I had prided myself on the fact that she always obeyed my call, instead of chasing an animal unduly. But again, I could only blame myself for not putting Elsa on the lead, and the donkey herdsman who had let the animals stray behind the others. It was an unfortunate coincidence that while being loaded on this particular day, the donkeys had behaved most provocatively to Elsa, walking close to her while she was chained up. No doubt later, when roaming the forest, she found one poor donkey alone. It proved too much of a temptation for her. In addition, this donkey was old and had given us a lot of trouble during the safari. So taking everything into consideration, I was tempted to forgive rather than to blame Elsa when she pleaded so touchingly for forgiveness and tried out every one of her tricks to win back our good opinion. One day we stood on the lip of the crater which divides the mountain and looked across to the northern part, which was not more than 4 miles distance, though we knew that it would take us a full 2 days' march to get there. Nonchalantly, Elsa balanced herself on the edge of the 2,000-foot precipice, a sight which nearly sent me into hysterics. But animals seem to have no fear of heights. The following day we descended, and the safari reached the mouth of the great Elsa gorge. There we made camp. During the day, thousands of camels, goats, and sheep, herded by tall, good-looking Rendeli tribesmen, passed by our way to water 4 miles up the gorge. They were followed by women leading strings of camels tied nose to tail, loaded with water containers. These held about 6 gallons each and were made of closely woven fibre. We walked up the cleft, or rather literally into the mountain. The floor of the gorge is a dry watercourse, which for about 5 miles rises gently between towering walls, which climb sharply on each side. When one penetrated still further, these walls attain some 1,500 feet in height and are sheer precipices. In places the gorge is so narrow that 2 laden camels cannot pass abreast, and the cliffs overhang, shutting out the sky. We went far beyond the watering place of the stock, where the trickle of water becomes a sizable brook, with many rock-bound pools of clear water. Finally, we were halted by a sheer fall of 30 feet. Herbert, who is a mountaineer, managed to get up it, only to find another high fall beyond. The Elsa used to be a favourite place for poachers, since it was easy to lay in wait for animals going to water. In fact, once an animal had entered the trap, it was doomed, since there was no way out except that which led past the waiting hunters. From Elsa it was a day and a half's march to the top of the northern massif, which we found to be more thickly inhabited by the Sambura and their livestock than the southern part, so Elsa's liberty had to be curtailed. We saw little game. Buffalo, of which there used to be a lot, had not, we were told, visited the northern end of the mountain for the last 6 years. There was also no greater kudu to be seen, though we observed the spoor of a few. George considered that this absence of game was probably due to the great number of Sambura stock, which were eating up the grazing and rapidly denuding the mountain. Owing to sharp, broken lava, the descent to La Yangalan, these words, was a most exhausting struggle, and not even the superb view of Lake Rudolph far below, reflecting the setting sun in its lead-coloured surface against deep indigo hills and an orange-yellow sky, could compensate us for our tumbles which grew more and more frequent. Towards nightfall, oh no, hang on. Elsa kept looking back at the mountain and cool forest and started to run towards them, so we had to put her on the chain. Towards nightfall, we lost our way in the dark. Elsa lay down every few yards, making it very plain that she had had enough. Although she was nearly full grown, she still liked to suck my thumb when she felt nervous, and there was a lot of thumb sucking that night. At last, some tracer bullets, fired by the advance party, guided us to the camp. When we staggered in after our nightmare march, Elsa refused food and only wanted to be near me. I also could not eat from exhaustion, and could well imagine the effort it had cost Elsa to carry on. She, of course, could not know why we were doing such a senseless thing as to struggle across sharp lava at night. It was only her affection for us and her trust that kept her going. In spite of the hardships she had endured on this safari, in the course of which she had walked well over 300 miles, the bond between us had only been strengthened. As long as she was with us and knew herself to be loved and secure, she was happy. To feel that we were responsible for such a proud, intelligent animal who had no other living creature to satisfy her strongly developed need for affection and her gregarious instincts attached us all the more deeply to her. Sometimes, it is true, she was unwittingly a nuisance, for instance, because we could not leave her in charge of anyone else. We became to some extent her prisoners, but she gave us so much in return for these small sacrifices. The difference between her reactions and ours came only from her natural characteristics, intended to be developed and used in the normal life of a wild lion. It was very touching to watch her trying to control the strong forces within her and to adapt herself to our way of life in order to please us. Her good-natured temperament was certainly due in part to her character, but part too may have come from the fact that neither force nor frustration was ever used to adapt her to our way of life, for we tried by kindness alone to help her to overcome the differences that lie between our two worlds. In natural life, as he finds food, a lion does not wander over great distances, and certainly Elsa had seen more of the world than she would have done living with a pride. Yet she knew her home, and whenever we returned from safari, she would go straight back to her habits and usual routine. And there ends chapter 5. So until next weekend, have a fantastic week. Take care of yourselves and of each other. Blessings, and may your gods go with you. Good night.